Tear down this wall, Reagan famously said of the Berlin Wall in 1987. The end of an epoch was declared. Barriers to labour and capital came down all across the world, and decades of globalisation followed. Since then, the top 1% has grown tenfold. Average wages have stagnated, and the world's poor are still, well, poor. Under open borders, such inequalities would only become a million times worse. 3 points in the speech today. Firstly, why everyday people in the host country become worse off. Secondly, why immigrants themselves are worse off. And thirdly, why the countries immigrants leave behind become worse off. And a rebuttal will be integrated throughout. James will then continue our case and speak about the existential threat to the state from open borders. But now moving on to my first substantive, why everyday, and emphasis on that, everyday people in the host country become worse off. Now, it may be true that open borders would increase economic growth in the countries immigrants migrate to. Cheap skilled labour, lowering cost of production, also the story goes. But we shouldn't only care about economic gains when assessing standards of living. GDP isn't everything. We also need to care about, number one, how the gains are distributed, and number two, non-material aspects of standards of living. By looking at these two aspects, it becomes clear that the working and the middle classes, the vast majority of the population, become worse off. Why is this? Let's start firstly with number one, the distribution of gains. When borders are open, wages for the majority stagnate. Two mechanisms for why this is true. Firstly, immigrant workers undercut local workers. This is because many immigrants would come from poor countries, so many would rather work below minimum wage than remain unemployed. But even if we take the best case scenario and assume that no immigrants work at below minimum wage, they still undercut local workers, many of whom were previously unwilling to work at the minimum wage. In light of competition from immigrants, to remain employed, local workers must be willing to work at reduced wage rates, putting downward pressure on wages. Secondly, immigrant workers also weaken the power of trade unions. Trade unions protect our lowest paid workers by propping up wages above market equilibrium through negotiation with employers. However, unions only have the power and the ability to set wages when they are able to restrict and withdraw the supply of labour. With open borders, they lose all that power. For both these reasons, wages of low and middle income earners stagnate, and the benefit of big business who take advantage of cheap labour to expand their bottom lines. So sure, the economy may grow, but everyday people are not the ones who benefit. But secondly, and just as importantly, non-material aspects of standard of living also deteriorate because of overpopulation. I know you said it's unrealistic. I'm going to explain why it's a concern that you should care about. So why does overpopulation occur? Immigrants come for jobs, and most jobs are in the cities, right? So migrants have disproportionately historically settled in large cities. And even if standards of living in cities deteriorate, migrants are still probably going to go to those cities, right? Because the standard of living there is still higher than the standard of living back home. So the people who suffer are the people who already live in those cities. So urban planning would not have accounted for such a sudden rise in population, right? No one suddenly expects open borders in like a year's time or something like that. And it takes time to develop infrastructure. It takes time to build houses, and it takes time to pave roads, right? And while they can build a lot of houses, they can't do it at a snap of a finger. They can't do it that quickly. It takes decades to develop infrastructure of that scale. So what does this look like in reality then? We see demand for housing exceeding supply. House prices skyrocket. People get crowded out of their own cities and become poorer in real terms. People have to line up to access basic services. Public spaces become crowded. People are stuck for half day in traffic. Again, it is the everyday people who have to suffer. Now moving on to my second substantive, why immigrants themselves become worse off. Now, side affirmative would have you believe that these immigrants are the people that we should care most about in this debate, right? No thank you. That open borders would allow more people to lead better lives. And we partly agree. Whichever side of the House is able to prove that they can create better outcomes for immigrants will probably be the side of the House that wins this debate today. But where side affirmative went wrong is when they assumed open borders would allow immigrants to lead better lives, giving their sort of revealed preference argument that immigrants must be better off if they choose to immigrate. I mean, if they're worse off, why immigrate in the first place, right? On the surface, this appears pretty foolproof, and to their credit, their argument probably holds true today. That is, the people who immigrate probably do lead better lives abroad. But remember, we have closed borders today, not open borders. And why is that important? Picture this. You follow side affirmative and you open all borders. Instead of thousands of new immigrants each year, you suddenly get 10 million. What happens? I'm sorry, you don't want to hear this, but backlash, backlash, backlash. And it might not be immediate. Some people still might migrate, but within a few years, there will definitely be backlash. Why is this? For all the reasons described in my first substantive, things like wage stagnation, effectively meaning I can buy fewer things. Things like overpopulation, causing rising house prices, overcrowding, etc., etc. But there would also be backlash from cultural differences. Now, as most of you can probably tell, I'm not from around this sort of area. 95% of people think I'm from Australia, but rest assured, I'm from New Zealand. But I can tell you that in New Zealand, some people get worked up, even if we accept a couple of hundred refugees. But why would this backlash become a million times worse under their side of the house? So, in the developed world, current criteria for immigration is strict. You usually need to be highly skilled and fluent in the local language. And this means that the immigrants who are allowed in are the ones who are most likely to contribute positively and assimilate. And furthermore, because the number of migrants is low relative to the size of the population, there usually aren't enough migrants to form ethnic enclaves, so there's ample contact with locals, helping foster mutual understanding. Under open borders, anyone and everyone would come, sure. So, what is true that under the status quo, there is backlash. But under your side house, backlash becomes so many times worse for the reasons described, for the cultural differences point that I'm currently expanding on. So, under open borders, everyone would come. Many would have no skills and no understanding of the local language, and they would come in enough numbers to form their own enclaves. And this would create resentment, which would only further isolate immigrants, creating a vicious positive feedback loop where these immigrants become more and more disenfranchised. So if you think that rhetoric against immigration is severe now, it would only become a million times worse with open borders. Now, why is this important? You may think, as you said, surely immigrants would be willing to tolerate some name-calling or some insults if they could improve their material standard of living. But name-calling would be the least of their worries. Governments would take a particularly hard line on immigrants. Why is this? This is because political parties want to win elections, and they can do so by appealing to as many people as possible. And when there's an intense backlash against immigration, political parties are forced to adopt policies that punish immigrants if they want to win. What would this look like? This could look like exorbitant non-resident taxes, restrictions on who can buy houses and use public services, etc., etc. For example, in Madagascar, you need to have Madagascan blood and citizenship to own property. Moreover, citizens would also take action into their own hands, as we've seen in Hong Kong. Employers may be compelled to avoid hiring immigrants as those that do are boycotted by the public, depressing wages and job opportunities for immigrants. The public may choose to selectively buy from locals, not shops run by immigrants. And this would simply be the next step from the sort of conscious consumerism that we see at the moment, right? When, because of Uber's horrible track record on sexual discrimination, individuals have opted to use their competitor Lyft, not because of economic reasons, but for social signaling. So while immigrants in our current world order may be able to improve the material standards of living by working abroad, this would not be true with the scale of immigration from open borders. There would be backlash, and that is a point that opposition must defend. Now moving on to my final point, why the countries immigrants leave behind are worse off. We'll see how much of this I can cover in the time remaining. Clearly not very much. Very proud to oppose. Thank you.